For all we have and are, for all our children's fate, stand up and meet the war. The Hun is at the gate. Now the Germans were west of Brussels, and still they came on. It seemed that nothing could stop them. The Schlieffen plan was working beautifully. The plan designed to carry the Germans through Belgium, brushing the Channel coast, then down through France, right round west of Paris, to attack the French armies from the rear. Now, everywhere, the French were in confusion. From Verdun to Charleroi, they were falling back. And the German right wing, 3 armies, 750,000 men, was coming into position to make its sweep. This was the loaded tip of von Schlieffen's flail, and the heaviest weight in the tip was General von Kluck's First Army. They skirted the historic battlefield of Waterloo, where 99 years before, British and Germans together had fought the French. Ahead lay a dreary industrial region. As they entered it, coming straight towards them without knowing, oblivious of danger, believing that they were joining in a great Allied advance, marched the 4 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force. Only the cavalrymen, under General Allenby, cautiously scouting ahead, were aware of the German presence. Then, suddenly, amid the slag heaps and straggling villages of a mining area, the army was ordered to halt and dig in. Field Marshal Sir John French had received new information. There would be no advance, but instead, a defensive battle. The British line formed a broad angle. The left flank, where the danger was greatest, was wide open. At its apex stood the little red brick town of Mons. Sunday, August the 23rd, came in with mist and scattered showers of rain. Church bells were ringing, calling the devout Belgian people to early mass. In their Sunday best, they stopped for a moment to stare at the strange-looking foreign soldiers who filled their town. They found it hard to believe that war was upon them. But these were the men of General Smith-Dorrien's 2nd Army Corps, digging in along the banks of the Mons Canal, preparing an awkward position for defense.
Quite suddenly, out of the blue, we saw cavalry coming towards us. They'd come out of the right on our right flank. I said, good gracious, it's Germans. So we immediately started to fire. We fired fuse north, and they got about 300 yards, I suppose, from the guns, and they wouldn't face it.
By 9 o'clock, the guns were in full cry, and the British Army began to learn about Jack Johnsons and Black Marias and coal boxes, the names the soldiers gave to the deafening, shattering explosions of the German heavy shells.
We were in the trenches waiting for them, but we didn't expect anything like the smashing blow that struck us. All at once, the sky began to rain down bullets and shells. I saw shells bursting to right and left of me, and I saw many a good comrade go out.
Then the German infantry began to come forward, surging towards the canal banks and the crossings at locks and bridges. There was a surprise in store for them, too.
They were in solid, square blocks, standing out sharply against the skyline, and you couldn't help hitting them. We lay in our trenches with not a sound or sign. They crept nearer and nearer, and then our officers gave the word. The Germans seemed to stagger like a drunk man suddenly hit between the eyes, after which they made a run for us, shouting some outlandish cry that we couldn't make out.
Poor devils of infantry. They advanced in companies of quite 150 men in files 5 deep. The first company was simply blasted away to heaven by a volley at 700 yards, and in their insane formation, every bullet was almost sure to find 2 billets. They had absolutely no chance.
This was the mad minute, 15 rounds of aimed rifle fire per minute that the British infantry alone were trained to do. At Mons, it worked the trick. The Germans were shot flat.
Our first battle is a heavy, an unheard of heavy defeat. And against the English. The English we laughed at.
Well entrenched and completely hidden, the enemy opened a murderous fire. The casualties increased, the rushes became shorter. With bloody losses, the attack gradually came to an end.
But it was all to no avail. On the left flank of the British and on the right flank of their French neighbors, German pressure was building up. Sir Henry Wilson, the Deputy Chief of Staff, clung obstinately to the hope of actually advancing. And then...
At 11 p.m., news came that the French Fifth Army was falling back still further. Between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., we drafted orders for retirement to the line Maubeuge-Valenciennes.
The retreat from Mons had begun.
We were very disappointed when we got the order that we have to break off battle and retreat. To do this is not an easy thing. It's quite easy to join battle, but it's not easy to break it off. However, we put down a curtain fire between us and the Germans, which enabled the infantry and cavalry to get away.
After all the tricks of the trade from their experience of small wars, the English veterans brilliantly understood how to slip off at the last moment.
On they came again. The Schlieffen plan was still apparently going like clockwork. The whole Allied line was going back, the end of a dream. And for thousands of frightened, homeless people, the end of a way of life. On the other side of Europe, the story was rather different. Here, it seemed, the Schlieffen plan was not working out so well. The Russian steamroller was on the move. Gathering slowly from the distant provinces of the Tsar's empire, the limitless manpower of Russia assembled and marched to war. Movement was slow across the endless plains with their bad roads and their railways few and far between. Army by army, with ponderous deliberation, the Russians gathered on the Galician front, where the equally slow-moving Austrians were taking up their positions. But in East Prussia, where the Schlieffen plan, counting on the slowness of Russian mobilization, allowed only 9 divisions to hold the enemy off, the Germans received a shock. On August the 17th, the Russians invaded East Prussia. This the Germans had not expected. Now, German people tasted the tragedies which Belgians and French were already learning to know too well. It was the fear of the Muscovite hordes, the ancient savage reputation of the Cossacks, the terror of men with slant eyes that drove these people out of their neat homes, away from the fields and farms on which they had worked so hard. Orderly, submissive, sick at heart, they made their painful parting. On August the 20th, the day the Germans entered Brussels, their eastern army was defeated at Gumbinnen. Königsberg, capital of East Prussia, was threatened by the Russian advance. And on August the 23rd, the day of Mons, the Russians won another victory at Frankenau. But it was their last. The telegraph wires bore their messages right across Germany and as far as Belgium to summon new German leaders. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were sent post-haste by Moltke to stop the rot. Out of the confusion of retreat on a battlefront over 100 miles wide, they shaped a bold plan. The Russian Second Army was now dangerously ahead of the First Army, with the Masurian lakes lying between them. Using the well-developed railway system of East Prussia to its limits, the Germans would strike at the isolated Second Army, now nearing the insignificant village of Tannenburg. A German general with a French name, François, a Russian general with a German name, Rennenkampf, a German general with a Scottish name, Mackinson, and a Russian general with a tragic name, Samsonov. These were the chief actors in the scene which followed. The lesser actors were some 500,000 soldiers who did the fighting and marching. This time it was mostly marching, particularly for the Germans, racing to cut Samsonov's line of retreat, to smash his army before Rennenkampf could bring him help. It took 5 days to do it, but at the end of them, the Russian Second Army was a wreck. 90,000 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner, rounded up like stock in a corral, and the head cowboy was François. General Samsonov walked away into a wood and shot himself. So East Prussia was saved. The trim towns would not be shattered. Cossacks would not burn the farmsteads. Instead, the war would now flow eastwards. What was more, Schlieffen's plan had stood the test, which was ironical indeed, since it was on the point of being abandoned. Not that any weakening of the German purpose was yet visible in the West. Each day brought new discouragements for the Allies there, as the flail thumped harder and harder against the left of the Allied line, while the center continued to give way, and the right held on only by the skin of its teeth. On one man, the pressure intensified daily, the Allied Commander-in-Chief General Joffre, each day bringing him new questions, but never an answer.
My first task was to seek the cause of these failures in order to find a remedy. Was it the enemy's numerical superiority? It appeared that as regards numbers, we were considerably superior to him.
Was it the French army's leaders who were at fault? If so, Joffre knew what to do. The Minister of War told him,
"Eliminate the old fossils without pity."
and this Joffre would do. But there was another question, which was more disturbing.
The French soldier is very impressionable, losing confidence as readily as he acquires enthusiasm, yielding to depression as quickly as he becomes exalted. Would he be able to hold out under this terrible strain?
And Joffre also asked himself a question which went to the very roots of everything.
Does the trouble lie in the strategic disposition of our forces?
On August the 24th, General Joffre reached a conclusion which shaped history.
What concerned me most was the encircling movement which the Germans appeared to be developing on our left. Now, it was the British alone who could offset this menace, and yet it was precisely this army to which I had no right to give orders. I had to content myself with suggesting. It seemed to me necessary, above all, to place on the left of the British army French troops to which I had the right to give orders.
This simple proposition contained a mighty seed, and everything that happened confirmed the strength of Joffre's idea. On August the 26th, he went to his second meeting with Sir John French. The scene was witnessed by a young liaison officer, Lieutenant Spears.
Joffre began to explain the purport of an order, extremely important, he'd issued. Whilst he was doing so, in walked Lansac, bustling in. Then Joffre went on explaining this order of his. When Sir John French said, "What about this order?" "I haven't seen the order." When General Joffre realized that his orders hadn't even been received and read by the British, he seemed overwhelmed with discouragement. It was the only time I've ever known that he seemed to lose heart himself, to be completely deflated.
This was an abject moment for General Joffre.
When I left British headquarters in the early afternoon, I carried away with me a serious impression of the fragility of our extreme left. And I anxiously asked myself if it could hold out long enough to enable me to regroup our forces. If this maneuver was to succeed, two essential conditions had to be fulfilled. First, our 4th and 5th armies must interrupt their retreat with partial offensives and counterattacks to give me time to assemble a new army on our left. Secondly, the British would have to resist tenaciously and yield ground only very slowly.
Joffre didn't know it, and neither did Sir John French, but that was exactly what the British army was doing. General Smith-Dorrien had decided to fight at Le Cateau. 2nd Corps was exhausted. It would have to stand and fight. It was strengthened by a new division from England on the left, and Smith-Dorrien hoped that Haig's 2 divisions would show up sooner or later on the right. And so, on August the 26th, the anniversary of Crécy, Le Cateau joined the company of the many insignificant French townships which had been pitchforked into history on a summer morning. Things didn't start too well. It was not the British 1st Corps which appeared on Smith-Dorrien's right, but the German 3rd Corps.
They come up like a football crowd leaving Hampstead Park. They come marching up in droves, firing their rifles from their right hips. They have absolutely no idea of aim.
British cavalry and horse artillery were driven in. The infantry in crude trenches and rifle pits were taken in enfilade, but they held on. And once again, their rifles had wonderful targets.
We'd hardly got our head covered before the ridge, about 3/4 of a mile away, was literally swarming with Germans in their field grey uniforms. And they advanced, and we would receive the order to rapid fire. It was probably 3/4 of a mile away, an extreme range for a rifle, but we rapid fired at 15 rounds a minute at these advancing Germans, and they broke up into smaller groups of probably 6 or 8, advancing through a cornfield where the corn was in stooks. As we rapid fired, they took cover behind these stooks of corn.
The line held, but the morning hours passed slowly as more and more German units came into action. The last British reserves were thrown in.
We were in reserve. The brigade was formed up, and orders came that we were required on the left of the line. We would go fast. And we marched 4 miles over the left of the line, came to a village whose name I don't really remember, and found Smith-Dorrien standing outside his headquarters, and he waved to us as we passed and said, "I think we're holding them all right. It won't be wanted here. And everything's going fine."
The exposed artillery batteries on the right flank lost heavily. Men began to drift away from the battle. It was time to go, if it could be managed. The great problem was to extricate the guns, many of them silent now, standing at all angles on the skyline, amid smashed limbers, dead horses, and dead men. The Royal Artillery does not willingly abandon guns. The teams dashed forward through cheering infantry.
As they came within view of the enemy, they were struck by a hurricane of shrapnel and bullets from machine guns. But still they went on. The officer in charge of the teams was killed. One team shot down in a heap before the position was reached. But 2 guns of the 122nd Battery were carried out without mishap. A third was limbered up, but the horses went down instantly.
The rest had to be left. The Germans were only 200 yards away. Incredibly, In the broad daylight of mid-afternoon, Smith-Dorrien's 3 divisions slipped away, and the Germans did not even know which way they had gone. This was the British Army's first real battle, and the cost was considerable. Nearly 8,000 officers and men, and 38 guns. And now they were retreating again, although they had done everything expected of them, and they had no sense of being beaten men. But tired troops can look like beaten men, especially to those who don't understand them. General Smith-Dorrien understood them perfectly.
It was a wonderful sight. Men smoking their pipes, apparently quite unconcerned, and walking steadily down the road. No formation of any sort, and men of all units mixed up together. I likened it, at the time, to a crowd coming away from a race meeting.
Joffre's liaison officer at General Headquarters, Colonel Huguet, did not understand the British Army. Joffre was appalled at his report.
The situation is extremely critical. For the moment, the British Army is beaten and is incapable of any serious effort. The 3rd and 5th Divisions are now nothing more than disorganized bands, incapable of offering the smallest resistance. Conditions are such that for the moment, the British Army no longer exists.
It wasn't true. It was just that they were tired.
We marched and marched day after day. We got very little food. I'd eaten my emergency rations at Bleecker 2, which of course I shouldn't have done. We had a tin of bully beef. I'd eaten that as well. And we were all very, very hungry. We certainly did get a cup of tea occasionally, or a canteen of tea. And we marched through a forest, which was very cold and dank. We were marching during the daytime, very big forest. It was very cold in this forest.
Sometimes cold, more often far too hot. The exhausted soldiers made their tour of France. 35 miles to the Somme and into Picardy, along white roads, dead straight between the poplar trees, dust rising off the cobbles.
I've seen infantry there with their feet bleeding. I've seen infantry with their boots off and putties wrapped round them. I've seen men sobbing and turning round asking our officers, why the hell can't we fight? Why won't you let us fight?
It was a despondent tide of humanity, laden soldiers beside burdened refugees, sharing the same wretchedness, treading the same long road which trudged wearily southward.
We came across 2 girls, only young girls they were just helping each other along. And they could hardly drag one foot before the other. A little bit further I saw one poor old chap with a long white flowing beard sat in a wheelbarrow there, and another old chap with a beard wheeling him along, a little girl by the side weeping. Further as we got along, there were thousands, not hundreds, thousands, taken to the woods at the side of the road. We saw them with what they had, the scanty possessions, taking refuge in the wood for the night. And these woods, they were just silhouetted in the background by the flames of the burning villages and hamlets which had been destroyed before them. These people were just homeless and hopeless.
The hopelessness of it all began to communicate to everyone. It reached even to the indomitable commander of the Allied armies, General Joffre.
It was a very strange thing to see a single man exercising his will over a mass of about 1 million men with the fate of his country in balance, having to satisfy the political requirements of his own government, the British government, having to face a catastrophic situation and never getting rattled.
Appearances and reality were beginning to drift apart. One appearance did match the reality. Everyone looked tired, and everyone was tired. Order out of disorder, hope out of darkness, reverse out of triumph, These were the realities which had to be plucked out of appearances. Southwestwards now, towards Amiens and distant towns that had never dreamt of war, marched von Kluck's First Army. If they were not checked, Joffre's new Sixth Army would be smashed before it formed. Could they be checked? It seemed that they just might be. For as they marched to the southwest, a gap grew between them and their neighbors, and the Germans, in their turn, exposed their flank. It all depended on General Lanzac. What followed was the Battle of Guise. August the 29th, the French columns wove westward through the early morning mists and across the river Oise. Their objective, St. Quentin, on the left flank of the German First Army. At first, everything went well, slowly, but well. Towards noon, the whole picture suddenly changed. Von Bülow's Second Army now took the French in flank as it came southwards, crossing the river Oise at the ancient town of Guise. It was an ugly crisis, but Lanzac rose to the occasion. He switched his reserve, still marching westward, into the northern fight. Throw the Germans back across the Oise, he ordered. And the reserve commander, General Franchet d'Espèrey, one of the most dynamic officers in the French army, was just the man to do it. On horseback, surrounded by his staff, Franchet d'Espèrey led his red-trousered infantry with colors flying, bands playing into the attack. It was the last of the old-time pageants of war, and it succeeded. They did throw the Germans back across the Oise. The Battle of St. Quentin came to nothing, but the Battle of Guise was a most valuable success, because now the straining Schlieffen plan broke down at last. General von Bülow, in great alarm, called to von Kluck for help, and von Kluck, halting his march to the southwest, turned inwards, towards Paris. The streets of Paris were sad and empty, the city of pleasure silent now and scared. The government had gone to the distant safety of Bordeaux, and many of the citizens had also fled. General Joseph Gallieni was in sole command. Before he left, the Minister of War had told Gallieni to defend Paris à outrance. Do you understand, Minister, the significance of the words à outrance? Asked Gallieni. They mean destruction, ruins, dynamiting bridges in the center of the city. À outrance, the minister repeated. Gallieni issued a proclamation.
Army of Paris, citizens of Paris, the members of the government of the Republic have left Paris to give a new impulse to the national defense. I have received a mandate to defend Paris against the invader. This mandate I shall carry out to the end.
The French people were learning fast what war meant. Everyone was learning. A special Sunday afternoon edition of the London Times, with a dispatch from a correspondent in Amiens, confirmed what the observant had been guessing from hints and suggestions.
It is important that the nation should know and realize certain things. Since Monday morning last, the German advance has been one of almost incredible rapidity. British forces fought a terrible fight which may be called the action of Mons. The broken army fought its way desperately with many stands, forced backwards and ever backwards by the sheer numbers of an enemy prepared to throw away 3 or 4 men for the life of every British soldier. Our losses are very great. I have seen the broken bits of many regiments. Some have lost nearly all their officers. To sum up, the British Expeditionary Force has suffered terrible losses and requires immediate and immense reinforcement.
Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, at once circulated an official correction to the Times correspondent's alarming dispatch.
There has, in effect, been a 4 days battle on the 23rd, 24th, 25th, and 26th August. During the whole of this period, the British troops, in conformity with the general movement of the French armies, were occupied in resisting and checking the German advance and in withdrawing to the new lines of defense.
In the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, Mr. Asquith, also made a statement.
It is impossible too highly to commend the patriotic reticence of the press as a whole, from the beginning of the war up to the present moment. The publication in the Times would appear to be a very regrettable exception, and I trust it will not recur.
The British public was not ready for too much truth. Even in victorious Germany, there were signs which contradicted the boasting of the press. A British-born German princess wrote on September the 2nd,
"Today I went out to the Grunwald to see the arrival of trains full of wounded, in the hope that I might see some English and help them. But it turned out to be a false report, and they were only transport trains carrying troops from the Western Front to Russia. There was a tremendous reception, but the troops looked too weary to respond to it. Very different from those of a short time ago."
And in St. Petersburg also, bad news was making its first impact.
I kept passing groups of people engrossed in very lively discussions. An especially large group was gathered before the bulletin boards of the newspaper Novoye Vremya. I was somewhat surprised, for I'd never seen so many people there. Certainly an event of exceptional importance must have occurred at the front. People looked upset, and a voice said, "What a disaster! Even generals have been killed. Why is the government deceiving us with news of victories?" To which another voice added, "It's exactly the same mess that happened during the war with Japan."
A chill struck at the hearts of the Allied nations. A great weight seemed to be pressing down upon them all. Whatever might be happening inside the German war machine, whatever mistakes the Supreme Command might be making, the advance of the German armies seemed inexorable, invincible. Yet all was not well with the mood of the German soldiers. They were becoming weary beyond words, and weariness breeds bitterness.
We marched on and on and on. We never dared to take off our boots because our feet were so swollen that we didn't think it would be possible to put them on again. And in a small village, the mayor came and asked our company commanders not to allow us to cut off the hands of children. These were atrocity stories which he heard about the German army. At first we laughed about it, but when we heard of other propaganda things against the German army, we became angry.
Our men are done up. The men stagger forward, their faces coated with dust, their uniforms in rags. They look like living scarecrows. They march with their eyes closed, singing in chorus so they shall not fall asleep on the march. The certainty of early victory and of a triumphal entry into Paris keeps them going. It is the delirium of victory that sustains our men. And in order that their bodies may be as intoxicated as their souls, they drink to excess. But this drunkenness helps to keep them going.
The British Expeditionary Force passed through the deep forest of Compiègne, pausing to fight a rearguard action at Villers-Cotterêts.
It was shortly after we passed a place called Villers-Cotterêts, which, when the nearness of Paris began to penetrate our tiredness, and we noticed the kilometre stones at the side of the road. But gradually we were getting nearer and nearer to Paris, 25, 24, 23. We couldn't believe it was happening to us, but every step nearer to Paris, as witnessed by these kilometre stones, were another blow on the head, which increased our depression, and we mentally felt that should we reach zero, that is Paris itself, that as far as we were concerned, we'd have lost the war.
Day by day, the essential switch of divisions and army corps from right to left was going on. Day by day, the picture changing, imperceptibly but decisively. And all the time, as the troop trains rumbled across France to the decisive point, as the last pitiful batches of refugees made their escapes, and as the last kilometre posts dragged slowly past the exhausted soldiers, General Joffre was waiting his opportunity. Hour by hour, the news came in from airmen, from cavalry, from secret agents, from commanders. Much of it was bad enough to frighten a lesser man to death. But one thing was certain. The German right wing, General von Kluck's mighty First Army, was not, after all, going to encircle the Allied left. On the contrary, if it held on to its direction, it was going to march across the defenses of Paris, where Gallieni was waiting like an eagle, and as it did so, its own flank would be exposed. The most dangerous mistake in war. Joffre did not fail to perceive this.
I actually saw him when, on the afternoon that he decided on the Battle of the Mons. I've never seen, very few people have ever seen anybody with such a burden placed on his shoulders that nobody else, just weighing the pros and cons of this movement and that movement, what orders to issue. It lasted quite a long time, perhaps a couple of hours. And then he got up, his decision was taken. And the orders went out that night.
The pendulum was coming briefly to rest. For an indefinable moment of time, the soldiers paused in movement. Under the gilding leaves of early autumn, round their campfires, the men of the warring nations drew a little breath. The moment of decision was at hand.
More coming up. Both sides encounter the phenomenon of trench warfare for the first time as the Great War continues next.